June 11th, 1944. A shattered, humid afternoon near Carentan, Normandy. The air smells of burnt cordite, wet earth, and something metallic and sharp. The scent of fresh war. The rhythmic thud of distant artillery is the only constant against the chaotic symphony of small arms fire and shouted commands. Inside the stifling confines of a captured farmhouse kitchen, Major Klaus Richter, a veteran tank commander of the Panzer-Lehr-Division, leaned over a rough-hewn table, a mug of stale coffee cooling beside him. Laid out on the table was a reconnaissance photograph of a knocked-out American M4 Sherman tank, its tracks wrenched off, resting on its side in a field crisscrossed with bocage hedgerows. "Look at this," Richter muttered, pushing the photo toward Lieutenant Volker Brandt, his junior political officer, whose face was still pale from a near miss earlier that morning. Brandt squinted. "Another Sherman, Major. Same old story. Towed out to the kill zone, burned out." Richter shook his head, drawing a thick pencil line across the photo. "No, not quite the same. Look closely at the hull. They've changed the hatches again." The American commitment to production meant constant evolution, and this particular variant, the M4A3, was visibly different. Gone was the angled, bolted-on armor and the separate driver and co-driver vision ports that had characterized the first Shermans they encountered in Africa and Sicily. This model had a massive, single-piece transmission housing, a fully cast hull, and, most distinctively, two large, hinged hatches positioned high on the glassy plate, giving the driver and co-driver far easier access. "They look bulky," Brandt observed, noting the size. Richter permitted himself a thin, humorless smile. "Bulky, yes, and utterly ridiculous. My men have a name for this new one, Volker, the Zigarettenpanzer, the cigarette tank." Brandt raised an eyebrow. "Why cigarettes?" "Because," Richter explained, tapping the large hull hatches with the eraser. "When the driver opens this massive hatch to peer out, it looks exactly like the lid of an American cigarette tin popping up. Big, clumsy, and exposed. Their designers must have spent too long in the motor pool smoking K-rations." The laughter around the table was short-lived and dry. To the Germans, especially those fighting in their superior Panthers and Tigers, the Sherman remained an inferior, disposable design. The Ronson Lighter for its notorious tendency to brew up into a tower of flame when penetrated. But as the Major continued to study the photo, a prickle of professional unease began to replace his scorn. "What is the tactical report on this kill?" Richter asked, his tone sharpening. A sergeant named Muller, a crewman who had witnessed the tank's demise, spoke up. "We hit it, her Major, around from the Pack 40 at perhaps 600 meters, right into the lower glacis. A clean penetration, center mass. Textbook kill. And it burned." Muller hesitated. "No, a Major. It did not." The crew bailed out, disoriented, but there was no secondary explosion. No fire. The tank simply stopped inert. "We secured the area this morning, and the hull is intact, just pierced." Richter tapped the photo again, a thoughtful frown creasing his brow. A direct, clean penetration from a 7.5 centimeters gun, and yet no furnace. Strange. The Americans must be changing something more than just the hatches. "I want every intact shell we find on these new Shermans thoroughly inspected. Pay attention to how the ammunition is stored. This cigarette tank might be more than just a joke." The battlefield was already proving costly, and if the Americans had quietly solved the Sherman's greatest weakness, it could change everything. Late June, 1944. A logistical motor pool, miles behind the crumbling German front near St. Lo. The sound of clanking steel and the grunts of Wehrmacht engineers replaced the roar of combat. Under the glare of work lights, they meticulously examined the hulk of the cigarette tank that Major Richter's men had successfully recovered. The engineers, led by the precise and skeptical Hauptmann Friederkeller, worked with the urgency of men seeking a critical weakness in the enemy's arsenal. The initial models of the Sherman, the M4 and M4A1, had famously stored their main gun ammunition in dry racks positioned high up in the sponsons, the hull extensions over the tracks. It was a space-saving design, but one that made the 90-octane gasoline-fueled engine and the highly volatile 37 mm, 75 mm, and 76 mm rounds dangerously close neighbors. A penetrating hit, especially one that fragmented the armor, would often ignite the fuel or strike the propellant charges, turning the tank into a spectacular, chimney-like pyre. This was the origin of the Ronson Lighter nickname, earned from the American brand of cigarette lighter whose slogan was, "Lights the first time, every time." Keller wiped grease from his forehead and peered into the breached hull of the M4A3. The 7.5 centimeters round had passed through the front, but the expected catastrophic damage to the ammunition storage was absent. "Hauptmann, look at this. The racks aren't where they should be," called out Sergeant Wilhelm, using a flashlight to illuminate the interior. Keller dropped into the hull. The crew had indeed relocated the bulk of the ammunition. Instead of the high, dry racks, the new M4A3 stored its projectiles, 76 mm high-velocity rounds in this case, in specially designed, heavily armored boxes bolted to the tank's floor beneath the turret basket. But that was not the only or the most crucial difference. "Give me a piece of paper, Sergeant. Quickly." Keller noticed a faint, sweet smell, not quite fuel, but something distinct and slick coating the floor of the hull. He used the paper to soak up a small puddle of liquid leaking from one of the damaged floor racks. "What is it, Hauptmann?" Wilhelm asked, confused. Keller rubbed the fluid between his fingers, then touched the tip of his tongue to it. "It is water, Sergeant, or something very close to it. The consistency is slightly thickened. They have submerged the ammunition." This was the answer to Major Richter's query, the invisible design change that had quieted the fires. The Americans had adopted wet-stowage ammunition racks, primarily in their M4A3 variants, but rapidly being retrofitted across the fleet. Each high-priority round was stored vertically in a water glycol mixture, an anti-freeze solution, secured within the lowest, most heavily armored part of the tank. The effect was twofold and devastatingly effective against German doctrine. First, a penetrating projectile had to travel through significantly more armored space to reach the relocated racks. Second, even if a round did penetrate the rack, the liquid absorbed the heat and fragmented shrapnel, quenching the sparks and preventing the propellant charges from igniting. It was a simple, elegant engineering solution. Keller climbed out of the hull, his face grim. The Americans are learning. Their cigarette tank is no longer the bonfire we expected. We must inform the Major. Our current targeting doctrine, relying on a penetration being a guaranteed kill by fire, is obsolete against these newer models. A penetration must now be a guaranteed kill of the crew or the mechanism, or we risk fighting a tank that should be dead. The initial German mockery of the M4A3's Zigarettenpanzer hatches was now turning into a chilling realization about the tank's hidden resilience. Late July 1944. The relentless, bloody struggle for the Normandy plain. The lessons learned in the St. Lo motor pool were now being brutally field-tested. Major Klaus Richter's Panzer-Lehr-Division was locked in a bitter defense against the American drive south, a defense that was becoming agonizingly costly. The Americans were pouring new M4A3s into the front, and the statistics coming back to the staff offices were undeniable and grim. The intelligence was simple. Earlier M4 Shermans, those with the old dry stowage racks, still succumbed to fire in well over 50% of penetration hits. But the newer M4A3 76W models, the ones with the large hatches, the 76 mm high-velocity gun, and most critically, the wet stowage system, had their rate of burning plummet to below 15%. This statistical shift changed the geometry of the battlefield. Before, the German tankers could rely on hitting a Sherman and watching the crew either bail immediately from the inferno or be incinerated, taking the vehicle out of the fight decisively. Now, a penetrating hit often resulted in a disabled tank, but one that was still largely intact and whose crew had a far better chance of survival. Near the town of Tessie-sur-Vire, a squadron of the Panzer-Lehr's Panthers engaged a column of these new Shermans. Sergeant Hans Gruber, a gunner with 4 confirmed tank kills to his name, lined up a shot on an M4A3's flank. Panzer-Granate. Fire. Ordered his commander. The 7.5 centimeters high-velocity round from the Panther's KWK 42L/70 cannon struck the Sherman squarely. The impact was violent, audible even inside the Panther. The American tank spun violently on its axis, its engine dying instantly, but the expected mushroom cloud of orange flame failed to materialize. Reload. It didn't burn, Commander. Gruber shouted, his voice tight with surprise. Target the turret ring, Gruber. Kill the crew. As Gruber traversed the turret, 2 American crewmen scrambled out of the wide, hinged cigarette hatches on the front glacis. They tumbled onto the dirt, momentarily stunned, but alive. A third followed from the turret. Instead of fleeing, the Sherman's commander, visibly angry, began shouting to his infantry support while his driver and co-driver, having survived the blast due to the quick egress the large hatches provided, scrambled to take cover behind their disabled tank. The immediate tactical consequence was clear. The dead tank was not truly dead. The surviving crew now directed artillery onto Gruber's Panther, forcing it to reverse quickly into the cover of a thick wood line. The engagement had been drawn out, messy, and inconclusive. The Americans had effectively lost the tank, but retained their crew and tactical influence. Richter, reviewing the after-action reports, saw a pattern emerging. The M4A3's resilience meant German tankers had to use more ammunition and take greater risks to achieve a definitive kill. They couldn't simply rely on the enemy to immolate themselves. They had to target the turret ring, the track mechanism, or repeatedly hit the same spot to guarantee structural failure. Targets that were smaller and more difficult to hit under fire. The ridicule had evaporated. The cigarette tank was proving to be a stubbornly persistent opponent. The simple relocation and submerging of ammunition had quietly, definitively, extended the Sherman's effective lifespan on the battlefield, shifting the odds subtly, but inexorably, against the German defenders in Normandy.